The ship moved through the darkness of space like a small light in an endless ocean. Commander Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the Earth vessel Starbound Hope, watching the stars drift past on the main screen. It was a quiet night, the kind of night where nothing seemed to happen and time moved slowly. The crew was 3 weeks into a simple supply run to station, carrying food and medical equipment to a small human colony on the edge of known space. Jake had made this trip many times before. It was routine work, boring but necessary. Lieutenant Emma sat at her communication station, her fingers moving over the controls with practiced ease. She was young, only 26 years old, but she was one of the best communication officers in the fleet. Her job was to listen to the void, to catch signals that others might miss, to be the ears of the ship in the silent darkness between stars. On most nights, she heard nothing but static and the distant whispers of dead stars. But tonight was different. A sound cut through the static. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but Emma recognized it immediately. It was a distress signal, broadcasting on the universal emergency frequency that all species in the galaxy used when they needed help. She adjusted her equipment, cleaning up the signal, making it clearer. The message was in the language of a peaceful species known throughout the galactic community for their advanced medical technologies and gentle nature. Emma had learned their language during her training, and as she listened, her face grew pale. She called out to the commander and told him he needed to hear this. Jake walked over to her station and listened. The message was simple but filled with despair. A research vessel called the Sanctuary of Knowledge had suffered a catastrophic engine failure. The ship was drifting toward a collapsing neutron star in the heart of the nebula. Over 2,000 scientists and their families were aboard. They had 72 hours before the gravitational forces of the neutron star tore their ship apart. They were asking anyone who could hear them to please help. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. He knew the nebula by reputation. Every spacer did. It was a region of space that no ship had ever successfully navigated. The radiation storms were deadly, the gravitational pockets were unpredictable, and the neutron star at its center was a monster that devoured everything that came too close. Going into the nebula was considered suicide by every species in the galactic consortium. He asked Emma if anyone else had responded to the distress call. Emma checked her logs and nodded slowly. They had already sent distress calls to 3 nearby alien fleets. Though a species of highly logical beings who calculated every decision with mathematical precision, had declined. They said the mission was statistically impossible and that any rescue attempt would only result in additional deaths. Though a proud warrior race with powerful ships had offered their condolences but stated that their vessels were not designed for such hazardous conditions. The High Command, known for their careful strategic thinking, had calculated a 97% chance of total crew loss and deemed the risk unacceptable. 3 of the most powerful species in the galaxy had heard the cry for help and turned away. Jake stood in silence for a long moment. He thought about the 2,000 on that ship. He thought about their children, their scientists, their families. He thought about what it must feel like to be drifting toward death, knowing that you had called out to the universe for help and the universe had said no. He ordered Emma to gather the senior crew in the briefing room. Within 15 minutes, the key members of the Starbound Hope were assembled around the central table. Chief Engineer Price was there, a tall man with grease-stained hands and tired eyes who could fix anything with enough time and spare parts. Navigator Turner sat beside him, a quiet man who had an almost supernatural ability to find paths through dangerous space. Medical Officer Dr. Lisa Chambers had come straight from the medical bay, her white coat still on, her face showing the concern she always felt when lives were at stake. Security Chief Santos stood by the door, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, and Pilot Amy sat at the end of the table, her small frame hiding a fierce determination that had saved the ship more than once. Jake explained the situation. He told them about the distress signal, about the vessel, about the 72 hours they had before the ship was destroyed. He told them about the other species who had refused to help, and then he asked to run the calculations. Worked on his for several minutes. When he looked up, his face was grim. He said the nebula was one of the most dangerous regions in known space. The radiation levels would be challenging but survivable if they took precautions. The gravitational anomalies were the real problem. They were unpredictable and could tear a ship apart without warning. He ran the calculations twice to be sure. The odds of successfully reaching the vessel were roughly 15%. The odds of successfully reaching the vessel and getting out again were less than 8%. The room fell silent. Jake looked at his crew, these 48 humans who had followed him across the galaxy on countless missions. He knew he could not order them to do this. It was too dangerous, too likely to end in death. So instead, he asked for volunteers. He said that anyone who wanted to attempt this rescue should raise their hand. He said there would be no shame in staying behind, no judgment, no consequences. This was a choice each person had to make for themselves. For a moment, nobody moved. And then Emma raised her hand. Price raised his hand. Turner, Lisa Chambers, Santos, Amy, one by one, every person in the room raised their hand. Jake sent a message to the rest of the crew, explaining the situation and asking for volunteers. Within an hour, the responses came back. Every single member of the crew had volunteered. Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest. He had never been more proud of his crew than he was at that moment. He knew the odds were against them. He knew they might all die in the attempt. But he also knew that somewhere in the darkness, 2,000 innocent beings were waiting for someone to help them, and humans did not ignore a call for help. He ordered to plot a course for the nebula. They were going in. The Starboard Hope entered the nebula at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning ship time. From the outside, the nebula had looked beautiful, a swirling mass of purple and blue gases that glowed with the light of dying stars. But from the inside, it was a nightmare. The moment the ship crossed the boundary, everything changed. Filled with clouds of radiation that pulsed and shifted like living things. The ship shook as gravitational waves passed through it, each one threatening to tear the hull apart. Commander Jake Harrison gripped the arms of his chair and watched the chaos unfold around him. Warning lights flashed across the bridge. Alarms sounded from every station. The ship groaned under the stress, metal crying out against forces it was never designed to endure. But they kept moving forward. Within the first hour, the radiation began to take its toll. Most species in the galaxy would have been dead within minutes of exposure to these levels. They had calculated this when they refused the mission. They had known their crews would not survive. But humans were different. They had evolved on a dangerous planet, a world of radiation from their own sun, of diseases and predators and natural disasters. Their bodies had learned to adapt, to heal, to survive. The radiation was painful and dangerous, but it was not immediately fatal. Dr. Lisa Chambers set up a treatment station on the bridge and began monitoring every crew member constantly. She administered medications to counteract the radiation exposure, checked vital signs every few minutes, and kept careful records of who needed rest and who could continue working. She had not slept since the mission began, but she refused to stop. Every time someone suggested she take a break, she simply shook her head and went back to work. These people were her responsibility, and she would not fail them. Navigator Turner hunched over his console, his eyes fixed on the data streaming across his screen. Plotting a course through the nebula should have been impossible. The gravitational anomalies shifted constantly, appearing and disappearing without warning. Standard navigation protocols were useless here. The computer could not predict what would happen next because nothing followed any logical pattern. So did something that confused every alien who later reviewed the mission logs. He stopped relying on the computer and started trusting his instincts. He watched the patterns of the anomalies, not with his analytical mind but with something deeper, something he could not explain. He felt the rhythm of the nebula, sensed where the dangers were before the sensors could detect them, and adjusted their course based on nothing more than a feeling in his gut. The ambassador, who later studied the navigation records, was deeply troubled by this approach. His species made every decision based on logic and mathematics. The concept of trusting a feeling, of making life-or-death choices based on something as unreliable as instinct, was incomprehensible to him. He wrote in his report that humans appeared to possess some form of precognitive ability, that scientific explanation. He was wrong, of course. What Turner had was simply human intuition, that strange gift that allowed humans to process information on a level below conscious thought and arrive at conclusions that pure logic could never reach. 8 hours into the nebula, disaster struck. A gravitational wave larger than any they had encountered hit the ship without warning. The primary propulsion system failed instantly, circuits burned out, connections severed, the main engine going silent. The Starward Hope was adrift, helpless, at the mercy of forces that would tear it apart within hours. Chief Engineer Price did not waste time on despair. He gathered his engineering team and ran to the engine room, pushing through corridors that shook and buckled around them. What they found was devastating. The main drive was destroyed beyond any standard repair. The parts they needed did not exist on the ship. According to every engineering manual ever written, the engine could not be fixed. Looked at the wreckage and felt something that might have been fear, but then he felt something else, something stronger. He felt determination. He told his team they were going to fix this. When one of his engineers asked how, admitted he did not know yet but said they would figure it out. For the next 14 hours, and his team worked without stopping. They did not sleep. They did not eat. They barely spoke except to share ideas and coordinate their efforts. They took parts from non-essential systems and modified them in ways that should not have worked. They rewired connections using methods that violated every safety protocol in existence. They built something that looked like a child's science project but somehow functioned as a starship engine. When the engineers reviewed the repair logs after the mission, they declared the modifications should have been impossible according to known physics. The materials had used were not rated for the stresses they endured. The configurations he had created had never been tested. By every measure of engineering science, the repair should have failed. But it did not fail. The engine roared back to life, rough and unstable but alive, pushing the ship forward once more. The crew cheered when the engines came online. It was a sound of pure joy, of relief, of defiance against a universe that seemed determined to destroy them. Jake Harrison felt tears in his eyes as he watched his crew celebrate. They were exhausted, radiation-sick, pushed beyond every limit they had ever known. But they had not given up. They had refused to accept the impossible. At the 40-hour mark, pilot Amy spotted something on her screen. A shape in the distance, barely visible through the swirling gases of the nebula. She enhanced the image, cleaned up the interference, and there it was. The vessel, the sanctuary of knowledge. They had found it. The ship was in terrible condition. Its hull was buckled and torn, lights flickering weakly along its surface. It was listing badly to one side, spinning slowly as it drifted toward the neutron star that loomed behind it. The star filled a quarter of a swirling mass of destruction that pulled everything toward its hungry center. Looking at it made something primal stir in the hearts of the human crew, an ancient fear of being consumed by forces beyond their control. But they had not come this far to turn back now. Jake ordered Amy to begin docking procedures. They were going to save those people or die trying. And as the Starward Hope moved toward the crippled vessel, the crew prepared themselves for the hardest part of the mission. Getting there had been nearly impossible. Getting everyone out alive would be even harder. Docking with the vessel was one of the most difficult things Amy had ever attempted. The two ships were caught in the gravitational pull of the neutron star, which meant they were constantly moving, constantly shifting, constantly changing position relative to each other. Standard docking procedures required both ships to be stable, to hold steady while the connection was made. Here, nothing was stable. Everything was chaos. Amy made her first approach, bringing the Starward Hope alongside the sanctuary of knowledge with careful precision. Just as she was about to engage the magnetic locks, a gravitational wave hit both ships and threw them apart. She cursed under her breath and tried again. The second attempt failed when a burst of radiation scrambled her instruments for 3 critical seconds. The third attempt came closer but missed by a few meters. The fourth, fifth, sixth attempts all failed for different reasons. By the 10th attempt, Amy's hands were shaking from exhaustion and stress. Sweat dripped down her face. Her muscles ached from holding the controls so tightly. Part of her wanted to give up, to admit that this was impossible, that they had tried their best and failed. But then she thought about the 2,000 on that ship. She thought about their children. She thought about what would happen to them if she stopped trying. She took a deep breath and tried again, and again, and again. On the 17th attempt, she came within centimeters of success before another gravitational shift ruined everything. On the 18th attempt, something changed. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was skill refined by 17 failures. Maybe it was something else entirely. But on the 18th attempt, Amy threaded her ship through a gap that should have been too small, compensated for a gravitational wave half a second before it hit, and engaged the magnetic locks at the exact right moment. The connection held, they were docked. Commander Jake Harrison led the boarding team personally. He could have sent others, could have stayed on the bridge where a commander traditionally belonged, but these were going to be scared and confused and dying. They needed to see that the people who had come to save them cared enough to put themselves at risk. Leadership was not about giving orders from a safe distance. It was about standing with your people when things were hardest. The team crossed through the airlock and entered the vessel. The conditions inside were worse than Jake had imagined. The air was thin and cold. Emergency lights cast a dim red glow over everything. The walls were cracked, and strange fluids leaked from broken pipes, and everywhere there were beings, roughly the size of large dogs, with 6 delicate limbs and large compound eyes that usually sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. But the Jake saw now were not sparkling. They were huddled in groups, their limbs wrapped around each other for comfort and warmth. Many were injured, their thin exoskeletons cracked or broken. Some were clearly dying. Their compound eyes, those beautiful windows to their souls, were dim with despair and acceptance of death. An elder approached Jake and his team. His name was, and he was the leader of this vessel, the one responsible for the 2,000 lives aboard. He moved slowly, his old body weakened by injury and exhaustion. When he spoke, his voice was filled with confusion. He asked Jake why they had come. He said the mathematics were clear. The probability of successful rescue was less than 8%. No rational being would accept those odds. He had already begun preparing his people for death, helping them find peace in their final hours. He did not understand why these strange creatures had risked everything for beings they had never met. Jake looked at this being who had accepted death with such dignity, and felt something break in his heart. He knelt down so he was at eye level with and spoke simply. He said they were here to help. He said that, where he came from, when someone called for help, you answered. It did not matter what the odds were. It did not matter if you had never met them before. You helped because helping was the right thing to do. Was silent for a long moment. Then his compound eyes grew slightly brighter, and Jake realized the old alien was crying. The evacuation began immediately. Jake organized his crew into teams, each one assigned to a different section of the vessel. They worked in rotating shifts, never stopping, never resting, pushing through exhaustion with pure determination. The work was hard in ways that went beyond physical labor. There were fragile creatures, easily injured by rough handling. Their young were especially delicate, small beings no bigger than human hands that had to be carried with extreme care. Security Chief Santos led a team into the damaged engineering section where survivors were trapped behind collapsed bulkheads. The area was dangerous, filled with leaking radiation and unstable structures that could collapse at any moment. And his team worked with cutting tools to break through the barriers, knowing that one wrong move could cause explosive decompression that would kill everyone in the section. They worked anyway. When a young asked why he was risking his life for them, seemed confused by the question. He said they needed help, that was enough. Dr. Lisa Chambers established a triage center in the main cargo bay of the Starboard Hope. She treated wounds, administered medications, and performed emergency surgeries on beings whose biology she had only read about in textbooks. When she realized she did not have enough hands to treat everyone, she began teaching medical staff human first aid techniques. The language barrier was difficult, but Lisa found ways to communicate through gestures, demonstrations, and the universal language of compassion. Lieutenant Emma worked as a coordinator, moving between groups, solving problems, keeping everyone organized. She learned the language as she worked, picking up words and phrases through necessity and repetition. By the end of the first hour, she could communicate basic instructions. By the end of the third hour, she was having conversations. They were amazed by how quickly she learned. They did not know that humans had evolved to be social creatures, that their brains were wired for communication and connection in ways that other species could not match. Hour after hour, the evacuation continued. Survivors streamed across the connection between the ships, carried by human hands, guided by human voices, saved by human hearts. And with each life they rescued, the crew of the Starboard Hope felt their determination grow stronger. They would not stop until everyone was safe. They could not stop. This was what they were made for. With 12 hours remaining before the neutron star's gravity became inescapable, Commander Jake Harrison faced a problem that threatened to destroy everything they had worked for. The Starboard Hope was a medium-sized vessel, designed for a crew of 50 with emergency capacity for perhaps 200 additional passengers. They had already packed nearly 1,000 survivors into every available space, filling corridors and cargo bays and storage rooms until there was barely room to walk. But there were still over 1,000 waiting on the sanctuary of knowledge. Jake stood in the cargo bay, surrounded by who watched him with their compound eyes, trusting him to save them. He felt the weight of that trust pressing down on him like a physical force. He had promised to help. He had told that humans answered when someone called for help. But how could he keep that promise when the mathematics were so clear? There was simply not enough space. Chief Engineer Price had run the calculations 3 times, hopping to find an error, hopping for a miracle. But the numbers did not lie. At maximum capacity, with every possible space utilized, the Starboard Hope could carry perhaps 1,400 passengers. They needed to carry over 2,000. The gap was impossible to bridge. Standard protocol was clear about situations like this. When resources were limited and not everyone could be saved, you prioritized. You made hard choices about who lived and who died. You saved as many as you could and accepted that some would be left behind. It was the logical approach, the mathematically optimal solution, the same approach that the and would have used. The elder understood this. He came to Jake with quiet dignity and made an offer that broke Jake's heart. Said he would stay behind with the remaining survivors. He said he was old and his life was nearly complete anyway. He said the young ones should be saved first. He spoke as if this was simply the natural order of things, as if there was nothing unusual about sacrificing himself for others. Jake looked at the old alien, this being who was preparing to die so that others might live, and felt something fierce rise up inside him. It was not anger exactly, though there was anger in it. It was not grief, though there was grief too. It was a refusal, a deep and absolute rejection of the idea that anyone had to die today. He told that no one was staying behind. He said they would find a way. Asked how this was possible, the ship could not hold everyone. The mathematics were simple, some had to stay. Jake said they would change the mathematics. He called an emergency meeting of his senior crew. They gathered in a cramped corner of the bridge, exhausted and radiation sick, and pushed beyond every limit they had ever known. Jake explained the situation, the numbers, the impossible gap between how many they could carry and how many they needed to save. And then he asked for ideas. For a moment no one spoke. The problem seemed too large, too impossible. And then Price raised his hand. He had an idea, he said. It was crazy and dangerous and would probably violate every safety regulation in the fleet. But it might work. Explained his plan. The cargo holds were currently filled with supplies, equipment, anything not essential to keeping the ship flying. If they vented everything into space, they would gain significant room. But that was just the beginning. The internal bulkheads that divided the ship into sections could be removed, creating larger open spaces. The crew quarters could be stripped down to bare walls. The life support system could be pushed beyond its normal limits if they were careful about how they distributed people throughout the ship. The modifications would be dangerous. The structural integrity of the ship would be compromised. Life support would be strained to the breaking point. There would be no margin for error. If anything went wrong, everyone would die. Finished explaining and looked at Jake. He admitted he did not know if it would work. He said the odds were not good, but it was the only option that gave everyone a chance. Jake looked around at his crew. He saw the fear in their eyes, the exhaustion in their faces, the absolute determination in their hearts. He asked them to vote. Anyone who wanted to try's plan should raise their hand. Every hand went up. For the next 6 hours, the crew of the Starboard Hope worked harder than they had ever worked in their lives. They vented cargo holds, watching months of supplies disappear into the void of space. They tore down bulkheads, cutting through metal with tools that were not designed for this purpose. They removed furniture, personal belongings, anything that took up space. Crew members gave up their quarters without complaint, knowing they would have nowhere to sleep. They stripped the ship down to its bones. The humans made sacrifices that they found difficult to understand. Crew members donated their own oxygen rations to create reserves for the additional passengers. They gave away their food, their water, their medicine. They gave away everything they had, keeping only what was necessary to survive. Emma organized the into efficient groups, using the language skills she had developed to communicate clearly and calmly. She explained what was happening, answered questions, calmed fears. When words were not enough, she used gestures and expressions, touching a frightened young one gently to offer comfort, placing her hand over her heart to show that she cared. Dr. Lisa Chambers redesigned the medical bay to accommodate 10 times as many patients. She created treatment stations throughout the ship, trained volunteers to assist with basic medical care, and somehow found time to comfort the dying even as she fought to save the living. The transformation of the Starboard Hope was nothing short of miraculous. A ship designed for 50 became a vessel capable of holding over 2,000. Every corridor was filled with. Every room was packed to capacity. The humans had given up everything they had to make space for the people they had come to save. The last boarded with 45 minutes to spare before the gravitational point of no return. Was among them, guided aboard by Jake himself. The old alien was weeping openly now, his compound eyes bright with tears he could not control. He tried to thank Jake, tried to express what this meant to him and his people, but the words seemed inadequate. Jake simply put his hand on shoulder and told him they should go home. The Starboard Hope limped away from the neutron star with 2,047 survivors packed into every corner of its battered hull. The ship was never designed for this. Its engines groaned under the strain. Its life support systems worked at maximum capacity, recycling air and water faster than they had ever been pushed before. Warning lights covered every console on the bridge, blinking constant reminders that the ship was damaged, overloaded, and on the edge of failure. Commander Jake Harrison stood at the center of the bridge, watching the neutron star shrink in the rear. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. His hands trembled from radiation exposure. He had not eaten in over 30 hours, had not slept in over 60. Every muscle in his body ached and his mind felt like it was wrapped in fog, but he was still standing. They were all still standing. The journey out of the nebula was almost as dangerous as the journey in. Navigator Turner guided them through gravitational anomalies that appeared without warning, trusting his instincts when the instruments could not keep up with the changing conditions. Pilot Amy held the ship together through radiation storms that should have torn them apart, her hands steady on the controls despite her exhaustion. Chief Engineer Price and his team worked constantly, repairing systems that failed every few hours, keeping the impossible engine running through sheer force of will. After 18 hours of careful navigation, the Starward Hope finally emerged from the nebula. The swirling clouds of radiation gave way to the clean darkness of normal space. The gravitational anomalies faded. The warning lights on the bridge went from red to yellow to green, one by one, as the ship realized it was safe. And then they saw the ships. Dozens of vessels were waiting outside the nebula, arranged in a loose formation that stretched across several kilometers of space. There were sleek cruisers, their crystalline hulls gleaming in the light of distant stars. There were massive warships, bristling with weapons that could destroy planets. There were elegant science vessels, their sensor arrays pointed directly at the emerging human ship. And there were others, ships from species that Jake had never seen before, all gathered in one place to witness something that none of them had believed possible. The communication system crackled with incoming messages. Ambassador of the was requesting to speak with the commander of the human vessel. Jake straightened his uniform as best he could, ran a hand through his dirty hair, and accepted the transmission. Appeared on the He was a tall being, thin and angular, with 3 eyes that blinked in sequence as he processed information. His voice was calm and measured, the voice of someone who approached everything with logical precision. But there was something in his tone that Jake had not expected. There was wonder. Said that his species had been monitoring the rescue attempt from the moment the human ship entered the nebula. They had watched the Starward Hope navigate conditions that should have been fatal. They had observed the humans make repairs that engineering principles. They had witnessed the evacuation, the sacrifice, the impossible success of a mission that every calculation had declared impossible. And now, said he, had a question. He asked why the humans had done this. He said they had no treaty with no trade agreements, no political alliances. They had no logical reason to risk their lives for a species they had never met, yet they had risked everything anyway. He wanted to understand why. Jake was silent for a moment. He was tired, so tired that forming thoughts felt like pushing through mud. But this question deserved an answer. He thought about everything they had been through, everything they had sacrificed, everything they had accomplished. And when he spoke, his words were simple. He said they heard someone call for help. Did not respond immediately. His 3 eyes blinked slowly, processing this information, trying to fit it into his logical framework. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different, softer, almost confused. He said he did not understand. Help had been available from species with better ships, better technology, better odds of success. The humans were not the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced. By every objective measure, they were among the least capable species in the Galactic Consortium. Why had they succeeded when everyone else had failed? Jake smiled then, a tired smile that held all the exhaustion and pride and love he felt for his crew. He said that maybe being the strongest or the fastest or though was not what mattered. Maybe what mattered was something else. 2 weeks later, Elder addressed the full assembly of the Galactic Consortium. The chamber was filled with representatives from every known species, beings of all shapes and sizes gathered to hear the words of someone who had been rescued from certain death. Spoke of what he had witnessed. He described humans who laughed in the face of impossible odds. He talked about beings who would give away their own food so that strangers could eat, who would sacrifice their comfort so that others could live. He spoke of a species that made decisions not based on logic or self-interest, but based on something he could only call compassion. He said that before the rescue, he had thought he understood the galaxy. He had believed that all intelligent species operated on similar principles, that logic and self-preservation drove every decision, that the mathematics of survival governed all behavior. But the humans had shown him something different. They had shown him that there was another way to exist, a way based not on calculation but on care, not on probability but on principle. The other species in the chamber listened in silence. Many had viewed humans as unremarkable before this event. Humans were not the strongest species, not the fastest, not the most intelligent, not the longest lived. Their technology was adequate but not exceptional. Their empire was young and small. They had seemed like a minor player in the grand story of the galaxy. But's words changed that perception forever. He concluded his speech with a simple statement that would be remembered for generations. He said that humanity's true strength was not measured in starships or weapons or scientific achievements. It was measured in something far more rare and precious. It was measured in heart. In the years that followed, a phrase became common throughout the galaxy. Whenever a crisis arose, whenever the impossible needed to be attempted, whenever hope seemed lost, species would look to each other and speak the words that had become synonymous with courage and compassion, and the refusal to accept defeat. Call the humans. And the humans would come. They always came, because somewhere in the darkness someone was calling for help, and humans never ignored that call.